So what do we do if the body that we found has been there for several days and it's already cooled down to ambient temperature and the livor mortis and the rigor mortis have both passed? Well, probably what we would have to do at this stage is to look at the state of putrefaction of the body. And once again, this needs an experienced person to make a judgment and give his opinion. So what is putrefaction and how does it happen? Well, when you're dead, of course, you're dead, but all the microorganisms that live inside you, they're not dead. And they keep on going, and they will start to eat you. Essentially, they will take your tissues, and they will break them down chemically and use them as nutrition. But as a byproduct, they will produce all sorts of chemicals, including gases and volatile chemicals. And it's these chemicals produced by putrefaction that give an abandoned dead body its particular smell. And if you've ever walked past a ditch where there's a dead dog, you know what I mean. So an experienced examiner can look at the body and make a judgment. Of course, he does have to take into effect all sorts of environmental factors, particularly temperature. If it's a very hot place rather than a very cold place, then of course there's going to be a big difference in the rates. You also get effects due to drug use, because if someone has been a heavy drug user, the presence of all those drugs in their body can affect the rate at which the microorganisms do their stuff. And again, this relies on experience. So one of the problems is there's not many hard scientific studies of the rate of decomposition of human bodies. So some studies are ongoing. One of them is, as you see, at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where they have a so-called body farm, which is an area of open ground which they fenced off. And they will place donated bodies in particular situations, clothed or unclothed, partially buried, etc. And then they can scientifically observe the process of putrefaction. And maybe this will make estimates more scientifically reliable. Well, during putrefaction, this is roughly what happens. After a few days, the body will start to discolor, and also it will start to swell. The reason for the swelling is the gases produced by the putrefaction process are inflating the body slowly like a balloon. As the days go past, the staining spreads, and the veins of the body start to become discolored as the materials in your blood decompose. Further days pass, the abdomen swells even more as more gas is developed by the putrefaction process, the skin starts to blister, and eventually the abdomen will become very tight and swollen because of all the gas inside. The tissues also break down. So the tissues lose their structural integrity and they start to soften. And that means that the organs and cavities inside the body which have been filled with these putrefaction gases then burst a little bit like balloons. In addition, the fingernails will no longer be attached to the fingers and they will fall off. So in a typical case, maybe in 4 weeks, the soft tissues will be starting to liquefy. And one of the consequences of this is that the face is no longer recognizable. So if the body is found at this stage, somebody just looking at it can't tell who it is, and it would have to be identified by other means. So a body exposed to the elements will ultimately turn into a skeleton. How long this takes is very dependent on environmental factors. So some people in some places might say it takes several years. Here in hot tropical Singapore, it can take as little as 2 weeks for that to occur. Now, not all bodies putrefy. If the environmental conditions are right, particularly if the conditions are extremely dry, then the body will become mummified and the tissues will actually be preserved. So mummification does happen by accident because the body happens to be in those circumstances. But of course, the most famous kinds of mummification is where it has been done deliberately. So these 4 gentlemen in the slide here were all mummified. There's Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt. This is Lenin, the founder of communist Russia, who was mummified and preserved by having a secret chemical injected into him after his death, and his body is still there in Moscow. If the Russians did it, then of course the Chinese did it, so there's Chairman Mao. And the last of these four gentlemen actually specifically wished to be mummified, and he said so, and he is Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher who was also the founder of University College London. And if you go to University College London, you can go and see him there. He's still there. An additional technique for bodies that are in this stage is to use what is called forensic entomology. Entomology is the study of insects. So how can we use insects to determine the time of death? Well, our dead body is lying somewhere outdoors, and it's starting to smell, and it's detected very, very quickly by insects. And the females, of course, are always looking for a good place to lay their eggs. And there's nowhere better than a dead body. They can lay their eggs on the dead body. When the eggs hatch, their children come out, that's the maggots. Then their children are assured of a really good supply of food so that they can develop and produce the next generation of blowflies. The life cycles of these creatures are usually fairly regular. So if you can find a maggot off the corpse and you can estimate how old that maggot is, you've got a good estimate of the time of death. But it has to be done right, because each kind of insect has its own life cycle with its own timing. The first thing you have to do is to know the species. This is not so easy from a maggot. So what is typically done is that the maggots are collected from the body, from the corpse, they're taken back to the laboratory, and they're reared to adulthood. When you have the adult, it's much easier to identify the species. When you identify the species, then of course you know what the life cycle is. So when you take your maggot back to the laboratory and you rear it to adulthood, you also time how long it takes to reach the adult stage. And then you can back calculate from the length of the life cycle how long it had been on the body. So here, for instance, is the life cycle of the blowfly. It starts out as an egg. The egg hatches to give a little maggot called the first instar. Then it changes to the bigger second instar, and then the third instar maggots. And then when they have fed sufficiently, they will turn into a pupa, and they will undergo their metamorphosis, and they will emerge as the adult, and the life cycle of the blowfly has gone round once. Sometimes this technique is very, very powerful. An example comes from this case from back in 1964 involving a man called Peter Thomas. In this case, some boys had gone down to the local woods because they wanted to collect worms so they could go fishing. And they found more than worms. They found the dead body of Peter Thomas absolutely covered in maggots. So of course the police came, and the police looked at the body, and they thought that it had been there for maybe 6 to 8 weeks. But a forensic expert, Professor Keith Simpson, was called in. And Simpson took a look, and he took a look at the maggots, and he disagreed with that 6 to 8 week estimate, and he said at least 9 or 10 days, not more than 12 days. And when they did the back calculation, that works out as June the 16th or June the 17th of 1964. And these dates proved to be extremely important in the prosecution. Now the police had identified a suspect in the case, and this was a man called William Brittle, who had had some financial dealings with Peter Thomas, and there was some bad result from this. So it was suspected that Brittle had murdered Thomas in some kind of dispute over money. So when this went to trial, one of the issues was the time of death. Keith Simpson has said that Thomas was dead on June the 16th or June 17th. Very importantly, Brittle had no alibi for that time, but he had a good alibi for dates after that. Well, the defense came up with 3 witnesses who claimed they had seen Peter Thomas alive and well on June the 20th or 21st, several days after Simpson says he's dead. So here on one hand you have the maggots, on the other hand you have the eyewitnesses. But the defense went a bit too far. They called their own entomologist, and they asked their own entomologist to testify based on the maggot evidence. And that's where it went wrong for the defense, because their expert turned out to agree with Simpson, saying the man was dead on the 16th or the 17th. Well, who are you going to believe? You're going to believe the eyewitnesses, or are you going to believe the maggots? Well, in this case, the jury preferred to believe the maggots, not the eyewitnesses. On the other hand, forensic entomology can also let you down. Let's look at the case here of a young girl called Danielle Van Dam, who was murdered back in 2002. She was about 7 years old. So she was last seen alive by her parents on the evening of February the 1st, when her mother put her to bed. The next morning, she was missing. So from February the 2nd, she had disappeared. Suspicion fell on a man called David Westerfield, who lived nearby, and he had gone off on a trip into the desert. This is in California. He'd gone off into the California desert in his RV for a few days and only came back home on February the 5th. As soon as he came back, he was essentially placed under police surveillance. So from February the 5th, the police were watching him, and you really can't get a better alibi than being watched by the police. It took a long time for Danielle's body to be found. It was finally found on February the 27th, so this is more than 3 weeks after her disappearance. It was up in the California mountains, obviously by this time badly decomposed, and also it had been attacked by animals, maybe coyotes or something. In fact, one of the ways they had to use to identify the body was to fingerprint it. So the fingerprint, even though the tissues were decomposing, they were able to get a fingerprint off the skin of the finger. Now, a key question was, when did Danielle die? When was her body dumped in the mountains? Well, here's the calendar of January and February. And they consulted a number of experts, particularly forensic entomologists, to get estimates of when her body was placed in the mountains. And what I've done here is to highlight in red those few days from February the 2nd to the 5th when David Westerfield was on his trip to the desert. So the first expert made this estimate here, that the body had been there since the second half of January. Well, of course, this is impossible because, as you know, Danielle was tucked into bed by her mother on February the 1st. This expert conceded that maybe he could stretch the dates through into the first week of February, which includes the time of Westerfield's desert trip. A second expert, looking at the entomology, put it from the 12th to the 23rd of February, basically the second half of February, which is time when Westerfield was under police surveillance. The third expert, a slightly earlier time frame, but still during that period of police surveillance. The fourth expert pinned it down to a few days. Again, it's in middle February. And another expert, again, it's late part of February. So when you see 5 experts in the same area giving estimates that are so widely varying, this does not lend very much credibility to the subject. And so the investigators, of course, also consulted medical examiners, and the medical examiners gave this estimate here from the 1st of February to late February. So as I said at the very beginning, it's very difficult to give a very accurate estimate, and that's why the range they've estimated here is so big. So what went wrong? Why is it that the entomologists' estimates are all over the place? Well, there are other variables that have to be taken into account. One thing is the weather. This is up in the mountains. The weather in the mountains can be very variable. So maybe the weather at the weather station, which was some miles away, was somewhat different from the weather where Danielle's body was left, and therefore it's not possible to make an accurate estimate. There's also the possibility of microclimates. Anyone who's been in the mountains knows that the south-facing side of the mountain, the weather is quite different, it's distinctly warmer, to the north side of the mountain. And in fact, in mountainous country, you only have to go a few hundred meters, and you can experience these changes. Another factor is whether the body was covered or not. If the body had been covered, then it would delay when the insects would find it. And this was never really resolved. And then again, of course, there's the possibility that actually David Westerfield is innocent and that the entomologists have got it right. Well, in the end, David Westerfield was found guilty and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and at the time of recording, he is still in prison awaiting that sentence to be carried out. So presumably the jury believed the evidence of the medical examiners and discarded the opinion of the entomologists, and they also considered other evidence such as the fingerprints and blood spots and a hair from the Van Dam family dog in the Westerfield RV as indicating guilt. But the story very clearly illustrates that making these estimates can be very, very difficult indeed.